as well, so that there are people responsible for passing on the information.
Thank you. We live in a time of great change and transformation as a diocese, with over half of the parishes in our community facing a 5-year window, at the end of which they will not be able to afford full-time clergy. What is your vision for the transformation of our congregational and clergy models of work, witness, and ministry?
Well, I want to say that it's not just whether you can afford a full-time rector, but it's also whether the land that your church is standing on is not going to be underwater in 10 to 15 years. That's the other thing that New Jersey and other communities are facing. Already the churches on the barrier islands are getting flooded regularly, and homes may be flooded regularly. So I think the other thing we need to do is look farther than 5 years out and look at what's happening there. I think there are great opportunities for collaboration between churches that are geographically somewhat close to one another. One of the great advantages of small churches is that people have a tight community, have a very good sense of their identity, and hopefully a very good sense of their neighborhood. And so what I would do is seek affinities between neighboring congregations, and they might not just be Episcopal congregations, but other congregations, and look for ways that we could partner in ministry. This is particularly important when it comes to youth ministry, because what children want when they show up in a Sunday school classroom or a youth group is other kids their age. That's the most important aspect. Free food is second. But nobody goes to a youth group with 4 kids. They just don't want to. They can't hide enough in it. So the advantage of affiliating is that you get more kids at the youth group event. You get more kids at Sunday school. You get more people participating in the pageant. In addition, other people who are, there aren't enough people of their age, young adults, or even middle-aged people with teenage children. I know that when I was attending church, when my daughter was a teenager, what I needed more than anything, pastorally speaking, was to talk to other parents of teenagers. And my kid was in a youth group, and I was a youth group leader, but I was commiserating with other parents, basically, about what was going on in our lives. So that's the tremendous advantage. The other thing you want to watch out for is clergy burnout, that you don't want clergy basically feeling like they're serving 2 communities as opposed to 1 community. I think it's actually a tremendous opportunity to look at how we can join together and share the gifts of one community with the other community. If you're great at outreach and the other one is great at discipleship, think what a gift you could be to one another, to give them opportunities for outreach they never had, to give them access to an EFM program and some other kind of adult formation program that they can't fully set up themselves. It can be a gift.
Can you share with us a specific artwork, a film, a book, a poem, a play, a painting, or piece of music that inspires you? How does this work of art inform your spirituality or theology?
I kept trying not to give this example, but it's the only one God's giving me. I read widely and I play classical music and stuff, but the movie, it's actually a trilogy, but I'll focus on The Godfather 2. It might be because I'm Italian and grew up Catholic, but let me explain why. The Godfather 2 starts with the little boy in Italy, the original Godfather, when he's a little boy, and he's a sweet, good little boy. And his father and then his brother is murdered in front of him. Then he gets swept off to the United States, still a sweet, good little boy. And he grows up, is a nice, sweet, honest man, marries a lovely woman, and then there's a bully, a murderous bully, kind of mafioso guy in Little Italy, in the Bronx, and so he decides to get rid of him in the style he knows how. And I assume you know the whole Godfather, I'm not going to go through all of it, but I focus on this moment because it's a person who's born good and experiences darkness and decides to enter it. If you notice, the Godfather, Don Corleone, has a code of ethics. He believes in being fair and honest and kind and loving until you cross him, and then he's going to get you. And they didn't always make the right decision. Now, as a Christian, I find that moving because, first of all, it reminds me, never choose vengeance, never dwell on anger, always revert back to love and forgiveness and accepting the weakness of others. So it warns me, Don't go there. But the presence of the priests, doesn't matter what denomination, the presence of the priest and the sacraments offering salvation, offering a way to turn oneself over and change anew through generations is always there. And I've watched it, I can't tell you how many times I've watched it. It's just moving, and it's frankly one of the few ways that a lot of Americans have seen church. That's the only way they get it is through TV and the movies. So it's a great series to show people if they're not coming to church. And it's Italian!
Thank you. No.
Really?
No, yeah. You can stay, but she wondered how many questions we asked. She said it felt like 3. Next is the Very Reverend Troy Mendez. Troy serves as a dean of the Episcopal Cathedral in Phoenix, Arizona.
Hello, everyone. It's great to be here with you today, this afternoon, and I look very forward to meeting each one of you after we conclude today.
Tell about a time when you have explored the missional opportunities and challenges in the communities you have served. How were you able to leverage parish strengths to engage with and shape missional presence in the wider community?
This is one of my very favorite topics, and I got to tell you why. I'm going to tell you a story. That when I first went to St. Margaret's Church in Palm Desert, California, that was my second call out of seminary. That is a resort community, very seasonal. People show up in November, they go home in April because it's really hot there in the summer. But it was a big church. In the winter, 1,500 people. And so I had this idea as the associate rector at the time that we were going to do EFM, Education for Ministry, which is these small groups, self-taught modules that people do for 36 weeks out of the year. And I was told, can't be done. No way. No, our people go home, they don't want to do it. Well, after a series of a number of conversations that I had with people who were pretty much year-round residents, I started pulling and cultivating interest in this from the base of the people that were there through the year. And people said, oh, I would like to do that. I need to learn more about reading the Bible. I would really like to know more about theology and how the church has kind of changed how it's thought over many years. And so group of 6 of them start out, and we were aiming for about 10 to 12 people. That would have been the ideal number. We ended up getting them together, and we started promoting this with the wider church. Well, what happened? People who normally went home at the summer extended their stay at the church in the area for 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 10 weeks, just so that they could still be part of that EFM class. And what I have the pleasure of reporting is that was 11 years ago when that began, actually 12 years ago when that began. And that EFM program is still continuing to this day. So when somebody tells you that something can't be done, it certainly can, but it's a matter of identifying the opportunities and the qualities of the properties that people have and what is informing their hearts, what is filling their soul and making them feel that they can come more alive when they're a part of their church community. This is an opportunity. I have worked in ministry contexts. My first 2 ministry contexts were with people in mostly people who were retired. And in those, what I always saw was a willingness to volunteer, a willingness to show up, a willingness to participate. And that is a core strength of congregations that have older populations. Now, my current congregation is much more mixed than that. I have people who are in college. I have people who are young professionals. I have people that, their kids moved out, but they're still living at home. They're thriving in their careers and so on. And then I have people also who are retired. I'm in a downtown congregation, so we have a whole mix of people. And that poses a different set of circumstances because sometimes volunteers, especially during the day, are a little hard to come by. But the fact of the matter is if you really take into perspective and get to know people at their walk of life, where they are, and identify the gifts and talents that they have for ministry, and cultivating a culture, for example, in this diocese, where we recognize the gifts and talents that each person has in ministry, so that the church can benefit from each person's individual and unique gifts. This is a culture that can be influenced, that can be developed, that can be shaped in all sorts of ways, but what it takes is that spirit of discernment and that spirit of seeing people exactly who they are, meeting them where they are, and cultivating a community that then recognizes the gifts and talents of each person inside that community.
We have several members of the LGBTQIA+ community in our diocese. Tell us about your work with these communities. What is your commitment to queer advocacy?
Thank you. Well, as somebody who identifies as openly gay, I can tell you that I have quite a bit of experience of this in the church. In fact, I was a bit of a pioneer when I was at Virginia Theological Seminary 16 years ago, because I was in a relationship at the time, and my partner at the time and I we are no longer together, but at that time we were the first gay couple to live in the married student housing. So I have been a bit of a pioneer in this realm for quite a while. My experience with working in fellowship and in ministry with the LGBTQ community in any kind of formal way goes back to my sponsoring parish days at All Saints Beverly Hills, where we had weekly fellowship groups, and we actually did a very intentional class on Christian formation about what does it mean to follow Jesus and identify as someone who is LGBTQ. It was phenomenal. We put an ad in a local paper and had over 120 people show up for the first class. It was revelatory to me as how hungry people are really for the voice of God, for the presence of God in their life. Now, let's fast forward. In my current position as Dean of Trinity Cathedral, one of the very first things I had to do when I was called as dean there in 2013 was I had to go on CNN with Anderson Cooper 6 weeks after I was there. And I got to tell you, I didn't know what I was getting into, because I did not understand the congregational dynamics of my congregation. I did not know the political landscape very well of Arizona. I didn't know a whole lot of things, and I was taking quite a risk. It was all about this religious freedom thing, and it had to do concurrently with LGBTQ rights. And so I went on the program and I spoke what I needed to say, and actually had very good feedback overall from the church. But as we pushed that further, what that did was it connected me then in my local community with many different organizations that came to me and said, we want to talk to you. We want to talk about some different things. One of the ones that we did very early on was about anti-bullying campaigns. We did this in English and in Spanish, and we ended up going on, this was the scariest moment I think in my ministry, was going on live Spanish television, speaking Spanish on Univision about an anti-bullying campaign. But it went very well. It was fantastic. I would say that what we've done is, one of the organizations that I've affiliated with recently is an organization called One Community in Arizona. And what we have done, I won an award from them several years ago, but what we have done is we have pushed very hard businesses and churches primarily to sign this thing called a unity pledge. And what it does is it pledges that in your organization that you are going to practice non-discrimination. You are not going to discriminate based on any of the things that the EEOC says, but also that you're not going to discriminate based on sexual orientation or gender identity. We have now, One Community is the largest coalition of businesses, small businesses, corporations, and churches that now have this in place in Arizona. And through our work of advocacy, we just recently had the new governor of Arizona sign an executive order banning discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity for anyone that is employed by the state of Arizona or anyone that does business with the state of Arizona. These are very important things that the church has a voice in. The church has a big voice in. And our job is to not only find a community, cultivate that community, and champion the fact that our baptism calls us into respecting the dignity of absolutely every human being and doing everything in our power to make sure that that plays out in the real world as well. Thank you.
Thank you. What new and hopeful perspectives and ideas can you bring to the conversations about church decline that support and encourage long-term solutions?
Well, what I would say is that we talk a lot, we hear this narrative of church decline at times, but I think the other thing that we hear in the news very often that we don't realize is how quickly the world is changing around us. The world is changing in such a way with electronic instant communication, you can communicate with anybody all over the world, that the way that we evangelize and the way that we are formed as Christians will change, that will continue to change. And from that change, we then have to become a church that is different in the future than we are today. This is not a scary task. This is about how we answer Jesus' call. When those disciples were along the Sea of Galilee and they were fishing and Jesus said, "Follow me," they didn't know what they were getting into. They had no idea at all, but they did, and their lives were fundamentally changed for all times. Then we have, let's fast forward in the Bible, the part where the disciples are meeting behind locked doors in John, and then Jesus appears to them, and he breathes on them and says, "Receive the Holy Spirit." Well, what does the Bible do with that narrative? Immediately thereafter, the disciples no longer hide behind locked doors ever again. They feel completely free to speak their mind, to say exactly who God is and what God has done for them in their lives. And that is the type of culture that if the Episcopal Church took on a way that we knew how to tell our story in new and unique ways with communication devices and platforms that speak to today's world, we will be just like those disciples. Not only will our lives be changed from now and through all time, but the church will actually be changed as well. We have unlimited opportunities for addressing any of these systems that we look at as the church, and we talk about it in some ways in decline, but I really invite us strongly that we need to talk about it as what are our ministry opportunities and who are we called to be as followers of Jesus in the world right here and right now, because this is a very exciting time that we're living in. We don't have all the answers. We're not supposed to, because we're not in charge. God is.
Communication is essential to effective ministry. However, it has been difficult to access clear and prompt avenues of communication, particularly with diocesan staff. Emails go unanswered and resources are tough to access. How would you remedy this communication disconnect and work to establish a diocesan culture of prompt and effective response?
Anytime an organization builds from one layer to another layer to another layer, there are many times that either people get lost in the process or information gets lost in the process. We all know this from when we were kids, because there's that game of telephone that I tell one person, they tell the next person, they tell the next person, and then by the time it gets back to me, that wasn't what I was talking about at all. Communication breakdowns are real. They happen. Organizations that are multi-layered frequently deal with this. This is not uncommon in the corporate world. Anybody who has ever, I used to work for Delta Airlines, and anybody that has ever dealt with airlines during travel messes, and recently we've had quite a few of those, that you know that they don't communicate well either. So nobody does this perfectly. I think we have to realize that first. However, it is imperative as a church that we get this right, because people's lives, people's souls, people's spiritual well-being are essential. They're vital to the church. They're vital to us. And we have to get this right with the way that we design our expectations of one another. One of the things that I would call for as a new bishop is a set of norms, a set of expectations that if a call or an email is coming into the diocesan office, you can expect within blank window of time that your call is going to be answered, because the diocesan offices and the diocesan staff have to be there to promote you. It isn't about promoting them, it's about promoting you directly and helping your ministries thrive in your local churches. And if we don't put in the tools and equip ourselves with the correct resources to be able to do this, we are failing you, and that is not acceptable. And so I would say that what we need to do is have a full evaluation of our communication protocols that are taking place in this diocese, and looking at the various electronic resources, phone systems even, that might help us and prompt us to be much more responsive to you in real time, to where you're not waiting on us and you're not wondering if we ever knew that something tragic happened in your congregation, or that you've got a boiler exploding and you've got to get it fixed and you need an insurance claim, or whatever the case may be. The fact of the matter is that the bishop's office needs to respond to you.
We live in a time of great change and transformation as a diocese, with over half of the parishes in our community facing a 5-year window, at the end of which they will not be able to afford full-time clergy. What is your vision for the transformation of our congregation and clergy models of work, witness, and ministry?
Well, the models of work, witness, and ministry that many of us live into were developed about 150 years ago. They really were. I mean, they've changed some because, we can do things at night now that we have electric lights in the church and things like that. But the model in many ways hasn't changed. And it is a time in Christianity that we need to look at this, because we as a church, even as ourselves, we relate to one another now very differently than our ancestors did 100 years ago. When people didn't drive cars all around and go long distances, you typically knew the people in the town that you lived in. You didn't really know people. You might have known somebody who you were related to somewhere else, but it wasn't really likely otherwise. And I think that we have to realize that all of our current structures that we have are things from the past that are going to require us to reevaluate and look at differently. So, for example, with churches that are struggling, that are looking at major paradigm shifts over the next 5 years, the first thing to do is to really look at the spiritual health and well-being of those congregations, and really identifying what is God's call on these people, and asking ourselves as a congregation, what is our purpose in our community? Who are we serving? How are we proclaiming the gospel of Jesus Christ to others? How are we salt of the earth and light to the world? And figuring that out, putting some things on paper, some ideas about what that might look like for each of us. It will be different for every congregation. But the fact of the matter is that's one place to start. Then doing an assessment of facilities, looking at what are future needs, how are these going to be dealt with, and creating plans and putting solid plans down. This is where we need to go from point A to point B. We have to do this for our own well-being and for the people that come after us. And having a forward look invites us to consider that the Holy Spirit is all around us, the Holy Spirit is inviting us to look ahead, to look beyond what we know, and to see what has not yet been revealed to us. Because God already knows, but we don't. And it is imperative that we create plans for each place, that we create benchmarks, and we look at ourselves and say, okay, if we need to make sure that we are growing at this point from 30 people to 100 people, and we need to come up with some type of plan to look at how we might achieve that. There are so many different ways to go about this, not only from staffing with full and part-time priests, but there are so many other vehicles through grants, through looking at community partnerships, through even church partnerships with people from other denominations that may want to do the same kind of ministry you're doing in your community. Because if you are doing it and somebody else is doing it and you work together, guess what happens? You start inviting more people into doing that with you. And after a while, they get to know you and they say, we want to be a part of this. We want to know what this Jesus person, who is Jesus? What is this about? We want to change our lives too because we see that you found some sense of blessing within you that we don't have, and we want that. There isn't a quick fix, and there is no magic bullet. There is no secret pill to making any of this work. But we have to allow ourselves the mental flexibility to be imaginative and to imagine how God calls us into something different. That, when it is different, we will find blessing from it.
Finally, can you share with us a specific artwork, a film, a book, a poem, a play, a painting, or a piece of music that inspires you? And how does this work of art inform your spirituality or theology?
Okay, I'm going to try not to get teary-eyed here. I want to tell you that I thought about this question long and hard, and I can tell you a specific painting that moves me, but paintings are very hard to describe to people if you've never seen the painting. So I want to go here instead. I want to assert that the Sagrada Familia Church in Barcelona is the work of art in this world that inspires me, and I want to tell you why. When I first went to Europe the very first time in 1994, I was very excited. I had taken tons of Spanish classes in college, and I was the first time, my family didn't travel when I was a kid, so I got to go to Europe with a friend of mine who was an architectural history major. That was a very interesting trip. And when we went on that, one of the places we went in Barcelona was this church called the Sagrada Familia that looked like a giant sandcastle. And so we go into this building that has no roof on it yet. That's a shell of a building on the outside with these gargantuan towers all around that symbolize the four gospel evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And you didn't have any windows in the building. They were all clear glass at the time. And but it was really interesting because the statues and the figures of all these religious people throughout time and biblical characters, they all were shaped differently and they looked differently, and they invited you to imagine God being present in our world now, not just a long time ago, but God is present with us now. Okay, 1994 is when that happened. Let's fast forward to 4 years ago. I hadn't been back to the Sagrada Familia until 4 years ago. And I went back one summer and I was like, yeah, okay, we'll go see it again. So it had changed because now they charged you to go in. Previously they didn't. But I go in and I step into that church. And at that point, you go into the church. There was a roof over it. And I walk into this room that is just beaming with colors and shapes and religious iconography and design. And I immediately was completely overwhelmed because what it told me was this all happened as I was developing my life from a college student and growing and seeking ordination and living into my ministry. And then here I am in this beautiful building that was blessing the world in ways, the new colors and shapes and the roof. And it gave me this overwhelming sense of how God was caring for me in my life. And how God, that it was this interesting parallel of the fact that, Sagrada Familia in 1994, the placard said that they thought they were running out of money and that they didn't know if they would ever finish it. And now what they say is, we're going to finish this, and we do have the money, but we're not finished yet. We're still going. And I love that because in my own sense of my faith and my ministry development, it's all about how God has a new chapter, that God turns the page and it's something completely new. I may not know what it is, but God does. And And so I leave you with this, that it's like the care and nurture of God has been always very revelatory to me in that building. And I cherish that, and it is something that I will never forget, because God truly does take care of us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And now I'd like to introduce the Reverend Canon Dr. Dina Cleaver Bartholomew. Canon Cleaver Bartholomew is the canon to the ordinary in the Diocese of Rhode Island.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me as your guest and for making time to be here today.
Tell us about a time when you have explored the missional opportunities and challenges in communities you have served. How were you able to leverage parish strengths to engage with and shape missional presence in the wider community?
One of the gifts that I have been given is the opportunity to participate in the College for Congregational Development and to become a trainer in the college. And one of the things we specialize in is working with churches, both lay and clergy leaders, to develop teams and equip them with a sort of toolbox, or we like to call them lenses, through which you can assess the different strengths and weaknesses and possibilities for mission within a church, and equip the lay leaders and the clergy team in that congregation to adapt this array of tools to use in their particular context, so that they can take advantage of the opportunities that happen in the context where they find themselves. So rather than having some sort of one-size-fits-all opportunity for mission, it really is customizable depending on the context in which you find yourselves. And when I originally began in the college, I was in the Diocese of Central New York, and they sent a team of clergy leaders so that we could learn together, and then we could confer with each other and go out and serve as consultants to other congregations. And now that I'm in the Diocese of Rhode Island, we've provided scholarships for lay leaders and invited clergy leaders who bring teams, and I go with them to the college and serve as a trainer, and we go back and help equip congregations throughout our diocese to be able to discern mission opportunities and to use this array of tools to look at how they might best operate within the parameters of their own community. The other thing I've seen is when I was in the Diocese of Central New York, we worked with the Reverend Dwight Shiley, with whom you may be familiar, who took asset-based community development from the University of Chicago and adapted it into Episcopalianese, so that you didn't have to read the theory in development and apply it to the church. He translated it so that we could learn how to go out into our neighborhoods and ask of the people around us what it is that our neighbors need, and how we could get out of the confines of our own four walls, because honestly, sometimes in the church I would drive by and think, people would never know there's a whole universe going on in there just because they're driving by. And we learn to get out of the confines of our own little universe and interact with our neighbors. And it really taught us to have a much more expansive and responsive view to the needs of our neighbors, including the hunger we didn't know was there, and a community that appeared to be well-to-do, but after the 2008 crash, mostly appeared to be well-to-do, rather than really was anymore, and had a high degree of shame around that, where they didn't want their neighbors to know they were going hungry to pay the mortgage. So we learned a lot more about our neighbors by being open and vulnerable ourselves. And I think that's one of the important things we need to know, is that if we are going to follow Jesus' command to love God and then love our neighbors as ourselves, we have to get to know our neighbors in order to be able to serve them and respond to them. So Dwight Shiley's work helped us to do that. And we took a number of different sort of creative and responsive mission measures in order to be able to get to know our neighbors and then respond to their needs, which is, I think, what we are always called to do. The other thing we've done is just, of course, we took in prayer requests from all our neighbors and integrated them into our worship services. So in addition to the practical aspects, we held them up in a life of faith.
Thank you. We have several members of the LGBTQIA+ community in our diocese. Tell us about your work with these communities and what is your commitment to queer advocacy?
Thank you. Well, in the diocese where I currently serve, about a third of our clergy are LGBTQ. So in Rhode Island, it is normal to encounter clergy couples who are either male and female, or male and male. So it's not an unusual thing. People are welcomed, people are fully integrated as LGBTQ members of the clergy and as lay leaders. We have at least one very well-known trans priest who is well supported and came through the small clergy group that I lead for new clergy. We have at least, I want to say, a dozen rectors who are LGBTQ, or priests in charge, clergy who are in charge of cures. And my history in working with LGBTQ community goes beyond the diocese that I currently serve into other dioceses where I have served, and in my own relationships with friends and colleagues. One of the places that my ministry with LGBTQ people really showed up was in my last youth group, where in a medium-sized church where we had probably 40 young people who were somewhat active in the youth group, we had 5 who were gay or lesbian and 1 who was trans. And they continued to come to church after confirmation class, which is alone in itself practically a miracle, and be engaged in the ministries of the church in ways that were appropriate for them as individuals. And the fact that they felt safe and loved and appreciated in that context tells me that we didn't always get it right, but they knew that they were loved and that we were trying.
What new and hopeful perspectives and ideas can you bring to the conversation about church decline that support and encourage long-term solutions?
Well, one of the things to realize about church decline is to look at the actual information. So we were fortunate enough to have Diana Butler Bass, who is a church historian and well-known lay leader, come and speak for our diocesan convention, and she reviewed the Pew Research information with us on church decline. And one of the interesting things is when they sorted out mainline churches, which is what the Episcopal Church and the UCC and the Lutherans and Presbyterians are, they saw, surprisingly, remarkably steady numbers, which we weren't expecting, especially among younger people. We often lament not seeing the generation that is right below the baby boomers and the next step down. But there are people who, even if they weren't showing up as regularly as the rest of us would like, still identified themselves with their churches. And still, because we are churches that understand the importance of affirming the full range of humanity, be they male or female or non-binary, be they black or white or Asian or Native American or some other racial or ethnic group, that all God's people are welcomed in our churches and seen and embraced as fully human, to be raised up and celebrated with their unique gifts and talents. Not every church approaches people that way. And much of what we see in church decline is because of 2 things. One, our culture is no longer church-centered. When people used to roll their eyes and lament about soccer and how soccer had interfered with church, I would say, well, when we were growing up, there were Sunday blue laws. That's the reason no one was at soccer, because you weren't allowed to be anywhere on Sunday morning other than church. And when those faded along with other cultural constructs that supported church, We needed to learn to step up and invite people to church and make it welcoming when they came. And we hadn't learned how to do that. But I am confident that is something we can learn how to do. The Episcopal Church should not be the best kept secret in town. If you have a fabulous restaurant you'd recommend to your friends, you also have a fabulous church you can recommend to your friends. If you have a favorite movie or a book you'd recommend to people, you also have a fabulous church you can recommend to people. We need to be able to learn to be as confident in telling our own stories about how we have encountered God in the place where we worship and serve as we are when we talk about other things we love. And if that's what we need to do to form disciples, then that's where we start. And we need to learn enough about hospitality, like the church where we are today, who's welcomed us as candidates, to welcome every guest who comes into our doors. And when we can do that, I think decline will be far less. One of the things I used to tell my congregation in the Syracuse area is that one of the more hopeful ways to invite people, a much lower threshold for many Episcopalians and the neighbors they have, is to invite them through the side door. Ask them to come to an event at your church. Ask them to come and help out in a social justice opportunity. Ask them to come and assist in the food pantry, or come to that hymn sing, or be at your potluck supper, because once they meet you and know that they will be welcomed by you, it's a much lower bar to come in for a worship service than it is to come into a worship service cold. The other thing is, if you continue your live streaming opportunities, it means they can come and check you out online before they ever have to show up, which can make them feel much safer about actually coming in person, because it's always a risk for someone new to step through your doors.
Communication is essential to effective ministry. However, it has been difficult to access clear and prompt avenues of communication, particularly with diocesan staff. Emails go unanswered and resources are tough to access. How would you remedy this communication disconnect and work to establish a diocesan culture of prompt and effective response?
Thank you. I serve on a diocesan staff, so I am well acquainted with some of these challenges. So one thing I will note is the appreciation that I have for your diocesan staff and how hard they work. And also that in your communications department, you have done an amazing job of very quickly adapting to online worship and communication during the pandemic and following through the less acute stages of it. Many dioceses were not able to adeptly turn to having online worship as you were here in New Jersey. So rightly so, the emphasis in your communications department these past couple of years has been in your streaming and online communications. But one of the results when you put your emphasis one place is necessarily it isn't other places equally much. So I think one of the things that would really be beneficial is an overhaul of your website. If you have, or would like to, take a look at the website for the Diocese of Texas, which is an enormous diocese. They have readily accessible resources on their website. So if you need to go and look up who you need to talk to, or where you need to find a resource, or how you get that grant, or what the rules are, or who the supply clergy might be, you can find it there. And rather than reinvent how to do that, it could serve as a template for a diocese as large as New Jersey to organize itself in a much more accessible and easy manner, especially for those of us who may not be as tech savvy as the people who usually do the designing, right? For those of us who are just going on to look for the thing we need at the moment. So having a really well-resourced website that's easy to navigate would really help with part of that communications and resource question. The other part to realize is any time that you are trying to be in communication with someone in the diocese, They're trying to do triage about the full-on faucet of email that's coming in at any given time. So we ask you, A, to be patient, and B, to let us know if it's really urgent. So I know in our email we have that red exclamation point for a moment. You know, if you really need to tell me this is important, use that important mark. But also, since I'm the canon to the ordinary, all the clergy and the senior wardens have my personal cell phone and can call me or text me. So they know the difference between it's an email question and I can get to it sometime soon, or it's an email question and it's not urgent, but let me know soon, you know, relatively, that's fine. And then there's the, oh my gosh, need to talk now, or the call. And I respond to all of those, and they know it. So when we had our last hurricane warning, I texted all the clergy of all the churches along the expected path so that there would already be a text waiting in their text chain to respond to me for a check-in once the hurricane hit. And that way, if they needed anything, they knew how to get me right away without having to look for it. And if they didn't, they just checked in and said, we're good. So that was as simple as that. So part of it is setting accessibility and reasonable expectations. And the fact that, as I used to tell my parishioners and now tell the clergy and lay leaders of the diocese, I won't know if you don't tell me, and I always appreciate a gentle reminder. And it is true.
We live in a time of great change and transformation as a diocese, with over half of the parishes in our community facing a 5-year window, at the end of which they will not be able to afford full-time clergy. What is your vision for the transformation of our congregational and clergy models of work, witness, and ministry?
Thank you. So in terms of transformation, if people are actually at the point where they are serious about transformation, not it's a nice thought, right? Well, transformation is like a New Year's resolution. It's always great until you actually have to do the work to make it happen. But if we are serious about transformation, then we need to be honest with each other. And that means building a relationship of openness and trust and candor, of asking people, what is it that you really need and is really essential for you? Because there are churches that would say, well, we have money and what we want is essentially a chaplain until we close. That's a very different thing from we're in a neighborhood where we have a vital ministry but not a lot of income. Right? They're in two different places. So we need to be able to have honest conversations about where we are, how much energy we have, what we feel called to do, how we might partner up with neighboring congregations, how we might re-envision ourselves and our ministry. What is essential? And I always come back to what Jesus says. What is the summary of the law? To love God and to love our neighbors as ourselves. And are we working on those two essential things? And if so, how? And what else can we let go of that may be draining our resources or our energy or getting in our own way? Because if we can lighten our load and let go of some of the things we don't need to be doing, so we can focus on the things we are really called to do, then that will make our path forward clear. If what we really need and can afford is a part-time clergy person who works in partnership with us or in partnership with another congregation, or we need to become a ministry center where we have a clergy person who comes in but doesn't have to spend a lot of time there because it's mostly lay-led, then that's what we do. So there isn't one right size fits all kinds of models for churches that are in decline. But there is the opportunity for open, honest, prayerful discernment and conversation. We had one church that's in my current diocese that came to the bishop and said, you know, we've got about 8 people left and about that much money. And we're thinking we should close. And they had just had a clergy person retire and they thought this is a good time to just shut it down. And he looked at the neighborhood they were in and said, why don't we try something new? And if it doesn't work, no harm done. And that church is now thriving in its context. It has 30 people on Sunday, which from 8 is a huge transformation. But that's not their primary ministry. They house a huge food program on Saturday mornings. The local fraternity unloads the food trucks, donates fresh milk. They hosted vaccine clinics for the state. They have a clothing closet. They have English as second language classes. They now have a young woman who came to me and said, I came from El Salvador where I was a teacher, and I made my way in Rhode Island through figuring out how to do a teaching assistant certificate. And I want to teach other Spanish-speaking people how to go through that same process so they can use their teaching skills to get jobs as teaching assistants. And we connected her with Dorcas International so that she can start that ministry. So from this place that was ready to shut its doors, it has an entirely new life. You never know.
Finally, can you share with us a specific artwork, that is a film, a book, a poem, a play, or a painting, or a piece of music that inspires you? How does this work of art inform your spirituality or theology?
The one that springs to mind is a poem, and I can recite the very first part of it, but it's too long for me to remember the entire thing, but it's called To Love What Death Can Touch by Yehuda Levi. And it is a poem that says, it is a holy thing to love what death can touch. And it is, I would encourage you to look it up. It was used in the television show, ironically, Godless, where they felt like the territory they were in the West was godless. And it was quoted on NPR as being from that particular show. So I was driving shortly after my mother died. And on NPR, I heard this poem. And I had to pull over on the side of the road, because to me it is profoundly moving. And it is a holy thing, because your love still lives in me, your laugh still lifts me, your light still burns within me. It is a holy thing, a godly thing, to love what death can touch. And it is about the gift of life and the spirit we see in the people that we encounter. And I can tell you that when we started the Blue Christmas service at my church, for all those people whose lives had been touched by death and were grieving in one way or another, this is the poem they asked for year after year, because their lives had been touched by the power of God in the presence of the people they encountered, and they had learned the gift of loving what death can touch.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. That concludes this portion of it. Jack, are we going next door? Do we know? I think we're going to the parish hall, which is out in. Oh, they're coming in. Just a few thank yous I want to say before they come in. I want to thank all the members of the Search and the Transition Committee who have gotten us this far. For those of you who are watching online who have stuck with us, we do apologize for the technical difficulties that we encountered in the first part of the session, the best laid plans and all of that. We particularly want to thank the folks here at Ascension and for their gracious hospitality, particularly Father McGuire, the priest in charge, the warden's vestry, and members of the church, with a special thanks to Linda Bale, who coordinated today's hospitality, along with Linda and Andy Amon, Tom McKenna, Janice Pregartner, and others. The next forum session will be tonight at 7 p.m. at Holy Trinity in South River. This forum will be live streamed, hopefully, and recorded. It will also be interpreted live in Spanish at the same time. For those details, I encourage you to visit our website, bishopsearchnj.org. We now invite you to engage in conversation with our panel of candidates. Thank you so much.